Welcome to the GeekBits podcast with your hosts, Mike, David, and Craig.
Hey everybody, we're here again for episode 6 of the GeekBits podcast, and today we were talking about BBSes and growing up without the internet. So before the internet, there was a thing called a bulletin board system, which was a
Which only us nerds knew about.
yeah, which was not mainstream at all like the internet was. I mean, the internet was a nerdy thing when it started, but BBSs were kind of this niche thing with just geeks. So, you guys want to talk a little bit about your experiences with BBSs, or should we go into like how they worked and
That's
what they did? Because not everybody may be familiar with it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think what we should do is exactly that. Let's take just 2 or 3 minutes and explain what a BBS actually was.
All right.
In fact, I think, David, you're probably the most qualified to do that. So, you want to?
Yeah, okay. So, basically, you had your computer. It didn't have to be a computer. It could have just been a terminal, but most people used a computer with a terminal program on it, which emulates a terminal. And then you would use the phone lines and a modem to call another computer, and that computer, in most cases, had one modem and one phone line. And it would send you text data that you could interact with over the modem. And that computer was not networked to anything else. It was literally like whatever's on that computer is all you have. And if that computer were busy, like if another user was on it, you would simply get a busy signal when you tried to call it. So you wouldn't even be able to connect. But generally, we just call it different BBS, if we were wanting to connect to something.
Yeah. And call waiting was a whole other problem we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, so...
and explain a modem, because phone lines back then were analog, so they sent a sound wave, or essentially the equivalent of a sound wave, over an electrical line, basically.
Yeah. And it wasn't terribly fast back then. Text was okay, a 300 baud modem, which is what we started off with. I could just about type as fast as it could send the data to the other computer, and then of course as the modems got faster, we got eventually 1200 baud
and compression. So there were kind of two things. The modems got faster, and we got compression, which helped dramatically.
But as an example of how slow they were, like if we wanted to download a game for our Commodore 64, especially on a 300 baud modem, I think it would take, I want to say like 7 or 8 hours to download a whole disk.
I never tried downloading any files when I used BBSs, but if you got interrupted, there was no pickup where you left off.
So
right?
in the beginning, there was no recovery mechanism, and later with they had protocols like Z modem and things like that added recovery. But yeah, in the original like X modem protocols, for example, if your parents picked up the phone, you were done. It was over.
This
Greg is holding up a modem.
Yeah, so Mike just had this floating around here. I have almost the same box. I had a 300 baud modem, but so the people on YouTube can see this. But this was like the first, almost exactly the first modem I used, and just would plug into the computer, and then you had to plug the phone line into the modem. So it would translate between digital and analog.
I actually have a funny story about this modem, and I guess since you pulled it out, I'll tell it real fast. So, this was the modem that I coveted. Like I wanted this modem so bad when I was a kid, because we had the 300 baud modem, right? Mm-hmm. And we couldn't afford it. We weren't all that well to do, and barely were lucky enough just to have the 300 baud modem we had. And so we had gotten this friend of ours Roy Livingston.
Oh my God, we just outed him.
Oh
yeah, Roy Livingston. So Roy, if you're out there,
maybe I'll bleep it.
Email one of us
in the post. I don't know, but he helped us acquire a modem through some nefarious means. And anyway, so I wanted that modem.
But how did you get a 1200 baud modem and I only got a 300 baud modem?
I think I paid more money. I don't remember.
I didn't pay anything. He just
I had to pay him for it.
It was a scam thing with a receipt or something, and I was like, la 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 la. I don't know.
He delivered it to me through my bedroom window at like 3 a.m. And
God, that guy was creepy.
He was. So, but anyway, long story short. So I saw this. I found out they had this is an old stock modem. So this was like originally when I got it, it was still shrink wrapped and everything was. So I bought it off of eBay, and I got it. And it's one of those moments in your life, and you'll know what I'm talking about if you've ever experienced it. But I opened this box like I opened it when I was a kid.
Right.
And it's like all of the 1980s smells were still in this box.
Oh my God.
So and it's gone now. But when I open it, well, maybe it's not. Let's actually open it. Yeah, it's gone. So when I opened it, it smelled like 1980s, and all of the memories of opening.
Like, was it the paper or the electronics?
No, the electronics and the plastics. This is the electronics and the plastics.
Yeah.
So opening this, like, just flashed through my head of all these memories of a kid that I'd completely forgotten about just because of that smell. It was really bizarre. I can only imagine if I'd have been high or something.
Right.
The effects that would have had. But yeah, so not to get too far off of it, but yeah, so there was no recovery method. If your parents picked up the phone while you were downloading, it was done. Same thing if you had call waiting on your phone, which we did as kids. Then the phone would actually interrupt the signal of the modem and go like doot click like that to let you know that there was another call coming in. Well, that completely obliterated the signal of the modem, and sometimes it would like sit there and jitter for a minute, and it would pick back up and keep going. But I'd say about 75% of the time it just hang up, and that would be the.
I think towards the end of that era, we actually found that there was like a prefix you could dial star something that would disable
star
call waiting.
72, I think.
Disable that so that you could have an uninterrupted call. So anyway, there were we use the term BBS, which obviously stands for Bulletin Board System, but of course they did a lot more than just.
Bulletin boards.
They did have those, and you could log on. There would be a whole list of topics that other people that call that particular bulletin board have been conversing about. But it's a really slow, like compared to today, it's a really slow thing because you might post a reply there, and then you might have to wait a day or two before somebody else would call that exact same bulletin board and
leave a message
and leave a reply to that. But we did have multi-line chat boards. And there were a number of them here in the DFW area. One of the original ones that we called was RMAC.
Yep.
And that ran on Apple II. I didn't actually know it ran on Apple IIs at the time, but I actually found that out later. And it only ran at 300 baud. Mm-hmm. But that was fine because it was just for chatting. And I think they had I want to say 8 or 16 lines. Now, the thing is, they wanted you to pay. This was a pay service, but they would let anybody on for a few minutes, I think, and then they would just log you off if you weren't a paying member. That way you kind of.
And if you paid, they enticed you to pay because you could. There was a slash command where you could type / asterisk or / other things. I forget exactly what the commands were, but if you paid, you could boot other people. You could boot people who were not paying. So, if there was somebody that made you mad,
you kind of had a little God mode.
They did,
going on.
And I remember paying. I somehow got mom or dad to pay. For a month subscription just so I could sit there and boot people off that weren't paying. And so, yes, I did play around with the pay mode.
So, yeah, of course, it was, the thing is, even with these multi-line chat BBSs, they were still people from our local area because people weren't going to call long distance. Because
that cost money.
It would have been very expensive.
Nobody had cell phones like this,
and in fact, that was true of all BBSs. Most of the people calling it were local to your area, and you could always you could converse with somebody, and you could talk about the mall on whatever street, and they would know what you're talking about because they live in this area. They all do, and so that was
so it was a digital community that was still tied to local geography,
exactly,
which is very different from the internet today.
Exactly. Today, you're likely to be talking to somebody on the other side of the planet without even realizing it.
Yeah. I don't think I told you guys. I recently dialed into a BBS a couple of times, maybe just a few months back. Hadn't done it in years, but there are still BBSs. You can, of course, you can call them over the internet, but you can dial them. Now, we're all on digital phone lines, so sometimes the text gets garbled or something like that. And apparently there's workarounds, you could use DSL filters if you could find one of those.
Yeah, there's any number of them now that you can just telnet or SSH to.
Right, you can still do that from the internet. But I actually dialed in using my phone line, using a 300 baud modem.
Wow.
Heard it answer. And then you could, when you sign in, you do not sign in with your username. You sign in with a number. Can you guess? I am just speculating here based on my programming background on why you sign in with the number and not with the name.
I vaguely remember that.
Actually, you're
kinda
bringing back
forgotten
some
about-
memories for me,
I
Craig,
don't-
and I'm trying to remember.
I don't actually know, but what I'm speculating is because you'd probably be using a computer kind of like the Amiga over
the
here
Amiga
or the
this
Commodore
over
64,
there, yeah.
and it would use disk drives, which were
Right.
slow and clunky. And
It would take a while for it to probably cross-reference the username with an actual user number.
Right, like where it is on disk. So it
Yeah.
probably using a number was closer to like an array or a memory address or
Yeah.
something. That's
That's
just my
actually
guess
probably
on
the
why
case,
you have to
yeah.
log in using the ID number. I'm like, why is this? I'm like, I'm back in the 80s. Like, of course it works this way. Like,
Yeah, actually, it's funny. I'd forgotten all about that, but now that you mention it, I do remember having to remember different ID numbers for different bulletin board systems, and I don't even know what you would do if you forgot your ID number. Was there a way to?
I think there was a way to look it
Look
up.
it up.
I feel
yeah,
like there was.
you had to
was.
send a letter with a stamp and like
Yeah,
to the BBS admin or whatever. And
So I wanted to mention something that a lot of people might not know. Is the experience of calling a BBS was very different between different architectures of computer. As an example, we grew up using the Commodore, and Commodore has this Petsky graphics and 16 colors, and so there's actually a 1 byte command to change the color or put one of those little graphics characters on the screen, and so BBSs took advantage of this.
And for those that don't know, those graphics are actually available on the keyboard keys of and I'll put a picture on the video, but actually available on the keyboard keys, so you could type them back to the bulletin board system.
Yeah.
And
right, they're literally
stuff.
a character replacement. So instead of typing a letter A, you might have like a squiggly or a curve or a heart or something like
right.
that.
But the point is, when you would log into a Commodore BBS, you would often get some kind of little logo or picture that had been drawn in these Petsky color graphics, and the menus would be very colorful. Like you'd clearly be able to see differentiations between like the descriptions of the commands and what the actual commands, push F for file downloads or whatever. And it was all really nice and beautiful. And of course, each BBS was different. However, they wanted to set theirs up. They had their own artistic style and everything. IBM MS-DOS machines also had ANSI color graphics, which kind of did the same thing, although they were less efficient because it often took like 4 or 5 characters. Like you'd have an escape sequence in order to change a color or something like that, so it wasn't as fast as like the way Commodores did it. But most computers, like Apple IIs and Macintoshes and any CPM machines and any of that kind of stuff, they just used standard ASCII. And those...
like A through Z and 1 through
1 through 0,
9.
yeah.
No color. They didn't even in the early days. Those machines didn't even have like a way to reposition the cursor or clear the screen.
Mm-hmm.
It literally
So it just kept scrolling up.
It just kept scrolling up like a teletype, and so it was not very pretty. And and like I said, I never called Apple. I mean, like as a Commodore user, I could call an Apple BBS and put my computer into ASCII mode, but it was like. It was so bland. It was so annoying to use when I was so accustomed to Commodore BBSs. But an Apple user, on the other hand, would not be able to call a Commodore BBS and get the color graphics.
They could still call it, but
They
they'd
could
have
still
to stay
call
in
it,
ASCII
but it
mode.
would be presented to them in an ASCII
Right.
form.
All of the special characters and colors would be removed.
Yeah, and so I think I feel kind of lucky to have grown up with the Commodore BBSs because. I kind of feel sorry for the people who grew up using Apple or some other kind of,
the hate mail that we're going to get over this
Oh yeah,
one.
yeah. Them's fighting words, son. All my Atari friends are gonna have the torches and pitchforks.
So I wanted to before we make kind of more of the comparison to and how that kind of evolved, because I want to talk about some FidoNet and some things like that here in a little bit. But there was this and I mentioned this in one of the other podcasts we did. Maybe it was I can't remember which one, but I had this sort of second life, and not to pun not intended there, but for the game Second Life.
Yeah.
But I had this sort of second life as a kid, and I would get on bulletin board systems like every single night, and sometimes I would stay up till 2 a.m. And sometimes it would be on the chat board, just chatting back and forth with people. Sometimes it would be downloading files. A lot of times it would just be typing messages into the bulletin board and talking to other people through the kind of the message-based bulletin system. A lot of times it was reading stuff because there was all of this information that was available on BBSs in addition to the games and stuff that you could download. So there was this thing called like the what was it called?
Are you talking about the Anarchist cookbook?
The Anarchist cookbook.
Yeah.
Yes. So and I would read how to build bombs or fuses.
Right.
Like there was all
we
this.
thought we were so
Oh
cool.
my gosh! And
like-
you know what's funny? Half that shit didn't work.
Oh
Like,
really? I never
oh,
tried
yeah.
to do anything. I was
so,
just like,
so Slater and I, and I can't tell you who this guy is. Because of his current career.
yep, yeah. Mind your P's and Q's.
We actually made. He had rabbits in his backyard, and so he had poop galore, right?
Right.
And so we tried to use the guide to make gunpowder out of the rabbit poop, which is exactly what it explained how to do.
Right.
And it didn't work at all. Like we tried it 4 or 5 times, and now I've read it again since then.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there were some things we did wrong, but I also know it would never like the way they explain it's not.
Well, like the blotto box.
The blotto box is another one.
What was the blotto box?
So the blotto box was you were supposed to be able to hook 2 wires up to your phone and like blow your whole neighborhood's phone system out. Like everybody's phone in the entire block would go down. And the reality of that is that if you had enough current to do that, it would just melt the wires go into your phone.
Right.
That would be the end of it. I mean, it's
that was total fiction. But there were some stuff in there that was real, like how to make thermite and a variety of things like that.
Absolutely, and a lot of the hacking stuff was actually real. Like there was how to make blue boxes and that kind of stuff in there, and they learned about the Captain Crunch, whistle, and of course a lot of that stuff didn't work, but it didn't work for different reasons. It didn't work because the phone companies had already fixed all of that by the time we learned about it. But yeah, so there was like this whole second life that I had as a kid where I was constantly talking and conversing with other people, and my parents didn't actually know anything about that, and if they did, they didn't even really understand it. And so I mean, I hate to say it like this, but if I had been a really gullible kid, and I could have been involved in a child molestation ring and never even have known it, they would have never even have known it because
I've had that talk with both my kids. Like, don't trust anybody on the internet. Don't assume their age or their gender or anything like that.
And I'm sure that luckily, I probably just never encountered one, but I'm sure there were predators back then that we just didn't know about.
There probably were, but I doubt there were very many because it was such a niche thing that they would had to have been familiar with that technology and whatnot.
Yeah, but I do feel like a lot of times predators seek out those niche technologies and things because that's where they find their prey.
Right,
but anyway,
perhaps.
They probably knew little nerdy kids on BBSs already have low self-esteem and stuff like that. So
Well, there weren't exactly a lot of girls on BBSs.
Yeah.
There were a few here and there, but the vast majority.
Yeah,
were young
and
males.
for any of the younger kids that are listening to this, we always have to say this: when we were nerds in the late '70s and early '80s, this was not cool. Like today, you got all these little cute girls playing games and streaming it on Twitch and stuff. Girls back then, if you played video games, they wanted nothing to do with you. I mean, it was a completely different world.
Programming. I'm a software engineering manager, and software engineering is still a male-dominated industry. I have a few women programmers that are great and work for me, and they're awesome. But yeah, back then it was very structured, especially where we grew up in Mansfield, but very traditional roles for men and women. And it's like, the way what my wife described it growing up, electronics and computers, that was boy science.
Yep.
Biology, that could be girl science, maybe,
Yeah, I've heard that exact analogy
Every
before.
single commercial advertising, like if you look on some of the old commercials advertising Commodores and Ataris and stuff like that, they always showed a 12-year-old boy using it because they knew that was the target audience.
No, some of them I did see that there would be like a little girl using it. There'd be like an educational thing, and the boy and the girl would be using it together, like a brother and sister or something, which was is actually kind of surprising. So I did see a couple of exceptions to that, but I didn't know any girls in middle school or high school that used computer. It's just a weird thing, which is odd because the first computer programmers were all women.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
The industry started that way, and then suddenly it's like, oh, they're making any money.
We can make some money at this. Yeah.
We're going to dominate it with men. Or I don't know how that switch happened exactly historically, but
Oh yeah.
But regardless, all the BBSs were dominated like by 95%.
Yeah,
men, or boys
So-
and men and whatnot.
So I think kind of the point I wanted to make, and then I want to kind of move on to the next phase, is that that I had a pretty big social life as a kid that my parents had no idea. Right?
Right.
I knew hundreds and hundreds of people by name and chatted with them every day on bulletin boards and things like that. And I mean, I had lots of normal
Actually-
friends like you and
Right.
I tried to explain this to them on a number of occasions because when they would pick up the phone and cause me to lose my connection, I tried to explain to them like you just severed my connection, and they're like, well, who cares? You're just talking to a computer. And I would explain to them, well, no, there's other real people on there I was having a conversation with. You just basically hung me up
You
and
just-
talking to like
Right.
6 other
took the
real
phone out
life,
of my hand and hung it up.
you know, and because there was no voice there, as far as they were concerned, it wasn't
Yeah,
an issue.
I
you
wonder
know?
if my mom would have been a little horrified that I was calling BBSs and communicating
No, that's
with
exactly
other adult.
that is exactly the
people.
point that I was trying to make earlier. Is like my parents would have been absolutely flipped out if they had understood what I was actually doing.
Yeah, my parents
as a
had no
12-year-old
clue.
kid, they had no idea. They had no idea. And luckily it all turned out okay and everything's great, right? But it is kind of like I always wonder. I wonder sometimes like what are my kids into that I
Oh,
am disconnected from and don't know, like
Yeah.
Snapchat or something, right? Okay, so BBSs, like David mentioned, they started out as this, one computer and one modem calls another computer with its modem, and then there was these chat boards, obviously, that maybe had like 10 modems or something on a single computer, and multiple people could call in and chat. But later on, they figured out that, hey, these computers that are hosting these bulletin board systems can actually call each other, no human needed. And you think, well, that's kind of pointless, but it's not, because what they did was they would exchange information. And so what you could have is you could have a bulletin board system, and you could have all these topics. And this eventually evolved, for those who already know where I'm going, this eventually evolved into like what they call FidoNet, right? But I'm talking about the very early stages of it. And so what would happen is you might have these, 5 or 6 topics on this bulletin board system. And at 3 a.m., that bulletin board system would call somebody else who was running a similar package software and send you all of its posts. And then that computer would send you all of its posts. So the next day, all of those bulletin boards would be updated where they would all be shared. And so it was like if you think about a forum today, but like imagine where there were like 10 different forums, but yours wouldn't have all the posts until tomorrow.
Yeah. But it also
right?
could do email. So
Emails, that's right.
Right. So in the past, like you could email another user on a particular BBS, but they could only get that email if they logged
On
in.
that same BBS.
Right. But then when FidoNet came along, then it would also, like, you could have a very unique address, and BBSs would forward
Yeah.
it through each other, almost like the post office would do.
Yep.
And it might take a little while.
It might
Yeah.
take days sometimes for the right two systems to connect together to get that email,
Yeah.
moved down the chain.
But they were essentially early networked computers. You
They were.
now had a network of computers all talking to each other. And it's funny how a lot of this hasn't changed. Like, it reminds me a little bit of it, like a distributed database kind of
Yeah.
thing. Like, or what do you call it? I can't believe they're going to take away my nerd card at work. Like a CDN, content delivery network,
yeah.
where it's like, well, we put this in one server, and now it's going to get distributed to all these other
all the rest
servers
of
to
them,
be
yeah.
more geographically close, which is probably why they were doing it with the same thing with FidoNet. Like, probably part of the advantage was I can be
Well-
in New York and call a local computer to send and receive email, but then at night it'll sync all that up maybe with the Texas.
Yes,
BBS.
and so exactly. So what would happen is you would want to communicate with somebody in New York, but it's a 10 cent a minute or whatever, 12 cents a minute back then connection to call. So but it was long distance rates were cheaper at different times of the days, and
Right.
so at 3 a.m. they could make a call for maybe 3 cents a minute and trade all those files real fast, and then take that connection back offline. And then that was kind of like this nightly batch job. if you
Right,
will.
right. About what year was this when this was taking place?
Oh my gosh!
I want to say like 1990, 91.
Okay.
I think FidoNet came out. I'm pretty sure FidoNet came out in the late '80s, like 80, because I ran a FidoNet node on my PC at Absher, so that would have had to have been in the late 80s.
Well, I didn't get a PC until like 1990 or later, possibly.
Cry
sometime
me a
ago.
river. I didn't get a PC
Yeah.
until 1996, and this bastard's
Yeah,
the one that
I'm
helped
familiar
me
with-
get it. So it was already
So,
running Windows 95.
And
That's
maybe
awesome.
that's why I wasn't familiar with FidoNet, because I was still calling Commodore bulletin boards up to that point, and Commodore bulletin boards didn't have FidoNet.
Yeah.
Now I take that back.
And you have to remember too, FidoNet was kind of a long. It was
didn't
like
happen
the
overnight.
It was like
Yeah.
the amalgamation of that system, but there were other systems before that did the same thing
Yeah.
or similar, like
Yeah.
bits and pieces of it.
Now I was actually calling some ANSI BBSes using my Commodore 128, or in the late 80s, because I had a DES term, which any
Yeah.
of the Commodore users will be familiar with, because it would actually allow you to call an ANSI in 80 columns and everything. But yeah, actually, there was one other thing I was going to mention that I used to call, and this was the only time our dad ever wanted to use my computer, because we had well, I guess we still have it. It was a newspaper called the Fort Worth Star-Telegram.
They had Startext.
They had a bulletin board system called Startext, and it was a multi-line system. So, typically you're not going to get a busy signal. They had multiple modems and whatnot. I don't know what it actually ran on, but when you called it, it actually offered free services for a number of things, including you could access the encyclopedia, which sometimes I use for my homework, because it was actually faster
Oh,
for me to
nice.
do that and type in something, and then I would get like an article on my computer screen. It
So there was kind of a rudimentary search system. You could at least put in like a topic
Yeah.
or alphabetically or something
and it
like
would
that.
search and give you several different
I
articles.
think you could only search the index, if I remember right, but that was still light years ahead.
Oh,
of
yeah.
But they also offered access to a lot of the newspaper information, including the classified ads. So my dad was always shopping for cars, so he would come in and say, "Hey, son, can you?" Well, he never called me son, but you know what I mean. But anyway,
He would always walk in my room and go, "Hey, Mike." So
Yeah.
imagine he went in your room and go, "Hey, David."
Yeah, so he'd want me to connect my computer to Startext so that he could. Now he wouldn't do it himself.
He would stand over your shoulder.
He'd
while
stand
I-
over my shoulder and tell me what he wanted, and I would look for like cars. Like I would type
So this
in-
was a text translation of the newspaper
Yeah.
onto the BBS as like an article with the same
Yeah.
classified ads and things like that.
And it was up to date. I mean, like in fact, it was
Wow.
actually you could see the ads and sometimes before the paper even printed.
Yeah, that's why a lot of people like to use Startext. Again, if you're thinking this is like classified ads in the back of the paper, right?
Right.
So people like to use Startext because the paper might come out tomorrow with the new ads in it, but at 7:00 the previous day, that night, right? You could already see the ads, and so like there might be something you're shopping for. You'd be the first one to get
Yep.
to it.
Who would have thought like Fort Worth, Texas would have had something that sophisticated in
Yeah.
the late 80s? Like
yeah, I
that's
don't even
pretty
know
amazing.
if Dallas had something similar or not.
See, I never used a BBS. I never used something like that for encyclopedias or classifieds or any. Pretty much, I just talked to people and played games. Like that was it. Like, so I feel like I missed out a little
Yeah.
bit on some of the benefits that BBS has had at the
In
time.
fact, well, I know there was one time he actually called on a classified ad, and the guy was confused. He's like, "Well, the ad hasn't even run yet. Where did you see this?" And he had to tell him it was on the. Of course, the guy didn't know what he was talking
Yeah,
about.
had
on the
no idea what
computer.
that
He just
meant.
said it's on the computer, or whatever. And
That's hilarious.
of course, this was all before eBay and Craigslist, so that was
Right.
that's how you sold stuff back then, was with classified ads.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that was, and then it still had all the same old problems though, where people said they were coming and then never showed up.
Right.
yeah.
Nobody's upgraded human behavior yet, as far as
not
we
at
can
all,
tell.
not at all. Then moving on from that, so they finally figured out and said, "Hey, we can start connecting these systems." Well, pretty soon there was several systems, and I'm trying to remember what the name of the dang company was, but there was the one Galacticom. There was this company that wrote BBS software called Galacticom, and they got this great idea that they could start linking their bulletin board systems together. Now, the internet was already a thing by this time, but it was really mostly just like colleges and things like that were connected together. But I want to keep this in the context of bulletin boards. So I'm not saying that this created the internet, just to be clear, right?
No, Al Gore did that.
Yeah.
That's right, Al Gore did that. So, but Galacticom and there was some other software, but BBS softwares that got the idea that they could stay connected all the time. So you would dedicate a phone line that would stay connected to another Galacticom BBS in the background, and so they were always trading information. So you might actually be logged on to one BBS, David might be logged on to another, but we could still chat with each other because they had a back-end dial-up connection between
In fact,
the
you
two.
could daisy chain them.
And you could daisy chain them. That's
And,
right.
I remember,
So you could hop from one BBS to the other.
Not exactly, but like you would go into a chat room, and what it would show is like all the local people on your BBS. It would show their text just like you would normally see it. But then if somebody was on a different BBS, it would show like a little parentheses in front of their name saying that they were on
Whatever BBS that they were connected to.
Like with Microshop, you would that was a local BBS here to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They had like 16 lines or something like that. And if you go into a chat room, and if somebody was connected to Microshop, it would just look like it always did. But when Microshop happened to sometimes be connected to another Galacticom BBS, it would show little parentheses in front of anybody's text who was connected to a different. So you kind of knew. Like, look,
They're not local on the same bulletin board that I'm on.
But at the same time, it was a live connection. And I remember the one time, and I was so excited about it because I was probably in like ninth grade, and I had just started taking German class, and they Microsoft for whatever reason connected to this Galacticom BBS named Galaxy, I think.
That had to cost a fortune.
Yeah, and they were connected for like 2 or 3 hours, and so
Wow.
there were all these German guys on there talking, and it was all live, and it was my first time to actually be able to talk to people in another country without making some kind of ridiculously expensive phone call.
And so you're typing messages back and forth to Germany, essentially.
Yeah.
Well,
Live.
you're typing messages back and forth. Just to be really clear about this, you're typing messages back and forth to your local bulletin board,
Right.
And then their software is making a connection to that other bulletin board and sending your messages back and forth to it to share with their users and vice versa.
Right.
So it was kind of a rudimentary internet, if you will.
Yeah.
But it was that was the very first time I was ever able to communicate live with another person outside of my own area, particularly
Especially
overseas.
outside of our country.
Yeah,
Right.
and I was so excited about that. Of course, it's commonplace today; nobody even thinks anything of it,
Yeah,
But back
yeah.
then, that was like really
It
cool.
was like a really big deal. A really
Yeah.
big deal. Well, so let's kind of move on then to the actual internet itself.
Well, before we do that,
sure.
I'd just like to touch on the one thing I actually used BBSs for, because you guys got a lot more use out of them than
man.
I did.
Constantly.
But the one game I remember playing a lot of was
I know
what
where
we
you're
talked
going.
about earlier. Was it was called AD&DC, which I think
Yes.
stood for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and Castles. That's how they differentiated it, I guess, from the official Dungeons
so
and
they
Dragons.
didn't get sued.
Yeah, but it was a very Dungeons and Dragons style game on a BBS. You guys knew I was going to involve Dungeons and Dragons in this
Of
podcast at
course.
some point. Wasn't going to go without. But you could dial in. You could only dial in 3 times a day. If you died or got disconnected,
That's right.
if you got killed or in the game, or you got disconnected because of call waiting, somebody or your mom picking up the telephone, you lost your connection. You lost one of your 3 tries, right? But it was a text adventure style thing, and it had a map in it. I mean, you didn't see the map. It wasn't like Ultima or
Now,
video game.
Could
But
you
it was-
pay to get more tries?
I don't know. I don't know.
That was monetized somehow, and I can't.
It seems
remember.
like it should have been.
Yeah.
And so I played it on my Commodore 64, and I loved that thing, but it just frustrated me that I would get killed or something would happen. I would get to play it so little.
Yeah.
And so it would tell you there was like grass to the north, and you would go there, and there'd be monsters you could fight. But I think it also had the option to interact with other players. So it
did.
must have been a multi-line BBS. And the players wouldn't necessarily kill you or fight with you unless I think you could go to an arena or something.
Yeah.
But you would see them going through the game, like, Bobby M 42 would, went north to the plains or something like that. I think it had something, really basic like that. Again, this is all text. There's no graphics. It's just kind of telling you. It's more like the video games, Zork or Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or that kind of thing. Like it's just telling you in text. So just in passing, that's my biggest memory of BBS.
I learned about that game from you, and I played the hell out of it when I first learned about it. I think I finally got bored with it because, it was all text, and I had lots of games that were kind of more fun, that were like Ultima and things like that, right? But the reason that I liked it so much was because of the fact that there were other players on there, and I could see them and interact with them, and it felt a little bit like a community.
Yeah.
Which you don't have with when you're playing Ultima.
Right.
Right.
But it was almost like a rudimentary, massively multiplayer
It was,
role-playing
yeah.
game, which
Yeah.
way ahead of its time. Like I wish I could find that software and fire it
Well,
up. somewhere.
I'll dig around for you. I'm pretty good at finding stuff like that. I bet it's out there somewhere.
That would be great. I would love to fire up like a Commodore 128 and a couple of disk drives, or
And,
even an emulator or something, and just
I
have it
think-
running somewhere.
Yeah, I think that software was probably. I'm gonna do some research, but I feel like that software was probably like AD&DC. Probably wasn't the name of it.
Right.
Like that was probably the name of the local one. That was,
Yeah.
Right.
Because this was, Mansfield, Texas, where we were dialing
Yeah.
from. So
Yeah, I'll do some research. That's fascinating.
maybe a topic for a future podcast, or
Maybe.
a Geek Pub project or something like that.
I'll have to
like-
build a BBS. Okay, so moving on to the internet. The internet was when I first heard about it, and I probably heard about it. I don't know. Probably heard about it 20 times before I actually took the time to go figure out what it was. Right, but I remember somebody saying, "Oh, this new thing called the internet." And remember, I want to be real clear about this. This isn't like the normal person finding about the internet. Like, the normal person didn't find out about the internet till, in some cases, years later.
Maybe early.
This is when nerds first started learning
Probably
about the
early
internet.
2000s is when the internet really started taking off and becoming a widespread thing, right?
yeah,
I
Like
think it was
late
earlier than
90s.
that. I think
it was-
95 to 96 is when it started to really take off.
Yeah, really take off.
I
But
still
I
felt
was,
like it was a little niche even then, but I could
it
be
was,
wrong,
it was, but I was on the internet. I mean,
early.
5 years before
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Right. But anyway, so when I, as a nerd, first found out about the internet, and I think you might have already said this, Craig, at one point, was they said, "Oh, you call and connect to this big network," and I'm like, "What do you mean connect to a network? You need to connect to another computer." Like, that's the first thing that went in my mind. Is
Right. I compared it to BBSs, and
Exactly.
I was utterly mystified by what the internet was, because I'm like, no, two computers talk, and they could talk to other computers. but
Right.
It just didn't compute for
And
me.
so the internet, I knew what networks were. I knew because I had, what was the old Novell network called? The IPX networks? Netware, yeah.
Mm.
So I had networks and all that running, and so I knew, that multiple computers could all be on a network. And then somebody explained to me that they said something along the lines of, all that we're doing is, instead of using the cable running around your house, because at the time we had ThinNet, which was the coaxial cables running around your house, right? Instead of having them all just running around plugged into computers, we're using the phone company network as an extension of that. And as soon as they said that to me, it was like, oh my gosh, I get it. The phone company network is just an extension of my local network.
Yeah.
It's this
Right.
big network. And
And you have multiple people calling in to this network, and so they're
Yeah.
all connected at the same time in much the same way that the FidoNet stuff
It
was
did.
doing back in
And
the
I
day.
have to tell you, one of the very first things when it clicked, and I remember this so vividly, when it clicked, I'm like, why didn't I think of this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really did. I'm like, why hasn't this been around forever? Like, why what happened here? How did this escape me?
And
How
of
did
course,
I
when
not see
Mike
this
and I
coming?
started using the internet, and I want to say it was around 93, 94.
Oh no, it was before that. It was probably like 91 or 2, at least for me.
I think it was around 93 when I first connected to the internet. And of course, it was all text-based, right? I mean, there was no web. Well, we had a web browser. We were using links, I think.
Links. Yep.
But there were very few websites to go to. Most of what we were
Almost
doing.
everything was Telnet.
Yeah, almost everything we were doing was Telnet, and then like you would Telnet from one machine to another. You would do FTP. You would do like things like Finger and Gopher and
Yep.
and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, when the web browser started to take over, especially the graphical web browser, which was probably not till like 1994-5,
Yeah.
things changed a lot.
That's the thing. So in the early days of the internet, you would do much like you did with the BBS. You were making a point-to-point connection over the global network to another computer, and in this case, we would do Telnet, and you would log into that computer, and then it would have information stored on it that you could like list files or directories, or sometimes it would have the equivalent of an encyclopedia or something that you could search through and those types of things. But there was no
Graphical
www.
interface,
Yeah,
yeah.
no graphical interface. No clicking on things. with the
Although I know
mouse.
I used to use web crawler, which
Yeah.
Yeah, and,
That was an early search engine.
But
that-
I would use it in the text version of it.
Yeah,
in
a
links.
very text-based.
Now
Yeah.
I did use links in school at UTA. So I started my long college career in 1991. So sometime after that, I was in school and I used links, and there was some kind of a text-based email that they
Pine,
were
probably.
still using.
Pine.
Yes, Pine, and it was like green screen kind of
Yeah.
text and stuff like that. But the first time I used the internet was actually over at a friend's house, and he had like a nice 486 computer or something like that, and he showed it to me, and it like took me a while to like really get like what was going on. But those were like my just dabbling experiences until you helped me get the AST computer that was running Windows 95, and by then we had graphical
Netscape
interfaces.
Navigator and all
then
of
I
these
used
different. Yeah.
I used web crawler and stuff like that, but you still had to dial into.
And there was absolutely no such thing as spam.
Yes.
amazing, yeah.
Well, actually, there was. There was this email that people would send around saying, if you'll send me $5 and then add your name to the bottom of the list.
I guess that counts as spam, yeah.
Well, that
then
wasn't.
eventually somebody's going to send you like $1 million or
Right.
something.
Yeah, but it wasn't like mass, spam like we get today.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember the very first time I got a spam. I think we were working at AST at that point. This was like 1995 or 6 or something like that, and it was on my AST, like my work email account, because we had CC mail back then, and we had no.
So CC mail.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And we
that
didn't have
brings
any
back
kind of
memories.
filters or anything, because like I said, there was no such thing as spam. And then every now and then we'd start getting these little, Nigerian scams and crap like that coming in, but it wasn't a huge problem until like maybe 2 years later, and then it just avalanche.
Right.
And that's an interesting kind of tangent too that we could spend a whole podcast on. But a lot of the original connections to the internet, there was no firewalls involved at all. So you had a router. If you were a commercial corporation, you had a router that was connected to a circuit that was connected to another router at the other end, and every computer on your network had wide open access to every computer on their network.
Yep.
And there were no firewalls.
Well, there was,
it took a while for people to go, maybe that's not a good idea.
and like the early days of the internet, there was no real encryption for anything.
None.
Email
Zero.
was all unencrypted. All your web browsing was unencrypted. Just everything was just completely open. You could literally if you had access to the router in your house, you could see what everybody in your family was sending and receiving.
Absolutely. And anything going over those lines, like a lot of network guys will about packet sniffers, and if you had a packet sniffer on a telco circuit like a T1 or something like that, you could read every single piece of data that was going across that line that those two computers were sending, wide open in the clear. I think it just kind of hit me, speaking of companies, I think AST was the first company I ever worked for that had a dedicated internet connection.
Yeah, I would agree.
Because I know that Mauser Electronics did not have one. Or if they did, they certainly
Well,
didn't let anybody use it.
We had dumb terminals at our desk, so we certainly wouldn't have had access to that. We only had access to the one specific software our login gave us.
Yeah.
And so, AST was the first time I ever had a dedicated,
Now, did you guys both start at the same time,
Like
roughly?
a month apart or something?
Wait,
or
so
what
something
year
like
was
A
that?
couple months apart.
And the interesting thing is, you were talking about how all the computers were open and whatnot. So, as you probably remember, every single computer and every single cubicle at AST had its own IP address, on the internet.
On the internet.
So I could actually go home and ping my computer
Oh my God, that's amazing!
at my cubicle, and even connect to the shares and stuff on my computer.
So let's break that down a little bit for the audience. So most internet connections today are what's behind something called network address translation, which means that you have a private network in your house, and then only data that traverses to the internet gets a public address. And so
your whole household shares the same
the
public
single
IP.
IP.
That means if you're surfing porn, you can always blame it on your wife.
That's right.
If anybody thinks that. It's really hurt
That's right.
because it's the same IP address.
So in the early days of the internet, there were plenty of addresses, and so every computer or device that was on the internet was assigned a public IP address. So, and then again, we talked about earlier the fact that a lot of companies didn't even have firewalls because they didn't know that they needed such a thing back then. Well, and they really didn't need something until the hackers figured out, you could do nefarious things and stuff. But anyway, so yeah, so your work computer could be sitting at your desk with a public IP address, and you could go home, and if you knew that IP address, you could connect to it and download files or whatever you wanted to do.
And you didn't take the computer with you because most likely it was a big tower on the floor. It wasn't a laptop or a phone or anything like that. So,
yeah, man, that brings back a lot of memories, and the same thing, like all the printers at AST, and again, this stuff. While we worked there, a lot of the stuff changed. They put firewalls in and some things like that, right? But I remember the printers there. You could send, like, if you knew because there wasn't internet protocol printing back then, so you had to do it over SMB, and there's a couple of tricks you had to do. But if you knew how to do it, you could actually send a print job from your house to your office printer.
Yeah,
I think I heard of people doing that. I think when you guys were working at AST, I was still waiting tables, so there was no need for internet at that. I was going to spill wine on you regardless of whether we were
whether you connected to the internet or not. Yeah. So, but I think I'm pretty sure AST is the first company where I would could sit at my desk and access the internet like all day long if I wanted to, and that was really, really exciting time in my life.
So is this like around 94,
This
96?
would have been 94
okay.
when I went to work for AST. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and AST had already been at their peak and were on their way down when I went to work there. Okay, well, thanks for listening to the GeekBits podcast. We are on YouTube if you want to watch us on video. We are available on all of the syndicated networks, so if you want to find us on your favorite podcast app, iTunes, Pandora, Spotify, all of those, we're there. See you in the next podcast.